In the smouldering ruins of St. Agnes's convent, nestled in a fog-choked valley, a fire ravaged its halls in 1904, leaving only ashes and silence. But when the flames were finally quelled, the bodies of 5 nuns were found disfigured, their lips sealed in an unnatural grimace. For decades, local authorities tried to bury the truth, locking away witness testimonies and convent records. Recently uncovered journals and cryptic diaries paint a chilling picture of their final days. What happened in those walls? Only the bravest should ask. Are you ready to hear what they refused to speak? The chapel had fallen silent long before the flames consumed it now. All that remained was a monument of soot and stone, the blackened skeleton of the once vibrant building. In the days after the fire, the town of St. Augustine's Hollow had become suffocated by the acrid smell of charred timber and burning prayer. Even the birds that had once nested in the trees outside the convent now avoided the place, their absence a heavier weight than any silence could bring. There had been screams, they said, but none of them had reached the town's ears, not in time. And though the survivors walked among them now, wearing the same veils and grey habits, none of them spoke. The fire had stolen their tongues, or perhaps it had taken more than that. Perhaps it had stripped them of their very souls. Among them there was one who stood apart. Sister Agnes walked through the streets as a shadow of herself. Her once flourishing youth now faded beneath the weight of sorrow and guilt. Her habit was frayed at the edges, the soft wool thinning from constant use. She had lost something in that fire, something more precious than the innocence of her vows, or the sister she had loved like a mother. She had lost her faith. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate. The town watched her from behind closed windows, their whispers following her as surely as the winds of autumn. They said she had seen it all, the blaze, the screams of the others, the heat, so unbearable it had turned the very stones to ash. But none of them dared ask her what had truly happened inside the walls of that chapel, for fear of what they might learn. The smell of ashes lingered in the air, clinging to everything, every surface, every shadow. It was in her hair, her skin, even in the rhythm of her breath. She could not escape it, no matter how far she wandered. As Sister Agnes crossed the town square, a lone bell tolled in the distance, a faint echo of something that had once held meaning. Her eyes, once bright with hope, were hollow now, their depths full of untold stories. She had stopped praying long ago, and yet the toll of that bell sent a ripple through her, a faint tug at the remnants of her broken faith. She tried to shake it off, to ignore the sting of guilt that pricked at her chest, but it was a fruitless effort. She had witnessed the fire from the outside, crouched behind the crumbling stone wall where she had hidden, clutching her sister's rosary in her hands. She had heard the cries from within, the desperate pleas for help, the frantic prayers for salvation. But she had not gone inside. She had not even tried to save them, not her sister, not the others. Instead, she had stayed there, frozen, watching, as the flames devoured everything she had once known. When the townspeople found her, standing in the smoke, the rosary still clenched in her palm, they spoke little of the fire. They spoke even less of her. She was a survivor, they said, but one whose soul had been left behind in the ashes. Now, as she passed the scorched remains of the convent, her eyes lingered on the charred remains of the chapel. The twisted spires of the steeple, now blackened and bent, seemed to reach out to her like broken fingers. She could almost hear the whispers of the lost souls that had burned within those walls, their voices trapped in the smoke that still hung thick in the air. The flames had taken so much from her, but they had left something behind, something darker than she could have ever imagined. Agnes, her voice called, soft and tremulous. From the corner of the square, Sister Agnes turned, her heart skipping a beat. It was Sister Beatrice, one of the survivors, one of the few who still wore her veil with some semblance of dignity. Her face was pale, drawn tight with the weight of unspoken burdens. She took a step toward Agnes, her hand outstretched, but stopped short, as if afraid to approach too closely. "Are you?" Beatrice hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the ruins of the convent. "Are you still praying?" Agnes felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat, but swallowed it back. Her hands were empty now, the rosary long discarded, the prayers forgotten. "No," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "I have no prayers left." Beatrice studied her for a moment, her eyes searching Agnes's face, as though trying to decipher the silent grief that clung to her every gesture. "There are others," Beatrice whispered, her words trembling like the last remnants of a dream. "The others, the ones who were inside. They. They will not speak. None of them will. Agnes's gaze flicked to the ground, and she swallowed hard. The fire had taken more than just flesh. It had taken their voices, their memories, their stories. The survivors spoke in nothing but silence, a silence that screamed louder than any words could. The truth, Beatrice continued, her voice lowering, will be buried with us, won't it? Agnes nodded slowly, the weight of her own guilt pressing against her ribs like a stone. She had seen what was left behind in the chapel. She had seen the bodies, some burned beyond recognition, others twisted in positions that defied nature. But there was one body she could not forget. Her sister, lying among the others, her face untouched by the flames, her lips still stained with the remnants of a prayer. The truth, Agnes knew, would never be spoken aloud. Not by her, not by Beatrice, and certainly not by any of the others. There were things in that fire, things they had all seen, that were far too terrible to ever be confessed. And so they would remain silent, bound together by their shared sin. Beatrice took another step forward, her hand trembling as it hovered over Agnes's arm. What do you think happened inside, Agnes? What really? Agnes shook her head sharply, her lips tight. You know what happened. We all know. A shadow passed over Beatrice's face, something dark and lingering. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she let her hand fall, her shoulders sagging beneath the weight of a grief too heavy for words. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The bell tolled again, a sound like the rattling of chains in the distance. Agnes closed her eyes, listening to it, feeling the weight of the world pressing down upon her. And then, without a word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps falling soft and slow on the cobblestone as she disappeared into the haze of the town square. The smell of ashes followed her, clinging to her like a second skin. The fire had left more than ruins behind. It had left a wound in the heart of St. Augustine's Hollow, and it would never heal. And in the silence of that town, in the suffocating stillness that had overtaken everything, there was something else. That had been taken, something no fire could ever burn away. Hope. The silence was a tangible weight in St. Augustine's Hollow, pressing down on the town like a leaden sky. After the fire, everything had been swallowed by it. The air, earth, even the sun seemed too dim to pierce through the heavy clouds that hung over the ruins of the convent. No longer did the bells chime from the tower, their steady toll marking the rhythm of prayer, of hours, of the daily turning of time. The tower itself had crumbled into blackened rubble, its great bell melted and twisted beyond recognition, leaving nothing but the haunting echo of a sound that never came. Yet Sister Agnes heard it. Each morning when the sun bled pale across the sky, she would hear the faintest chime, soft but insistent, like the breath of something living beneath the rubble. It was the bell, or so she believed, though it had ceased to ring in the quiet hours between sleep and waking. It would come, a single toll that vibrated deep in her chest, sending shivers through her bones. There was no bell, no tower, only the echo of something that would not die. She had thought it madness at first, the grief of the fire stretching her mind thin, but as the days bled into weeks, the sound grew clearer, more frequent. It was as though the very air around her had absorbed the resonance of that bell, and now it refused to be forgotten. It filled every corner of her thoughts, a constant reminder of the thing she could not understand, the thing that had happened inside the chapel. The whispers of the townspeople had reached her ears, but none spoke of the truth. They spoke of God's will, of the tragedy, of loss, but they would not speak of the night. No one knew, they said, no one but the survivors, and they had their tongues bound by the flames. There was only one question left: what had happened inside? Sister Agnes could not shake the need to know. She could not rest until the silence was broken. On the evening of the third week after the fire, she made her way to the old convent grounds, the path worn by years of familiar feet, now buried beneath soot and ash. The wind carried with it the scent of burning, the acrid scent that seemed to cling to her skin, to her soul. She pulled her habit tighter around her shoulders, her face drawn and pale as the moonlight poured weakly through the cracks in the sky. Inside the remains of the convent, the surviving nuns sat in stillness, their faces veiled in shadow. They moved like ghosts among the charred ruins, silent and watching, their eyes distant and closed. They did not look at Agnes as she approached, and she did not expect them to. She had seen them all, the broken, the hollow-eyed, the mute. They spoke to no one, except to each other. sometimes in the dead of night. But what they whispered then, Agnes could never know. She had tried to listen, but all she heard were sounds too faint to grasp. Like the rustle of wings in the dark, she stood in the doorway of the chapel, her heart drumming in her chest as the silence pressed in on her. There were no words to be found here, no answers. She was alone with her questions, and yet she had come. There was one nun who had not fallen silent. Sister Lucille, the youngest, among them, had been found at the edge of the chapel in the wake of the fire. Her body broken, but her mouth still capable of sound. But her voice had been twisted, shredded, like the fabric of the chapel itself. Since the fire, she had not spoken a word, but Agnes had seen something in her eyes, something dark, something knowing. Sister Lucille sat in the farthest corner of the chapel, staring at the broken altar where the flame had consumed the holy symbols. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the thin fabric of her habit still stained with ash. When Agnes entered, Lucille's eyes flicked toward her for a brief moment, and then returned to the altar, as if nothing in the world mattered but that wreckage of what had once been. Agnes stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, as if the very act of approaching the silence would break something irreparable. "Sister Lucille," she said, her voice trembling slightly, though she did not know why. I need to know. What happened that night? What happened inside the chapel?" Lucille did not respond. Her eyes never wavered from the wreckage. "I know you remember," Agnes pressed, her throat dry. "I know you saw. You must have seen. Please, tell me what happened." Still, Lucille did not move. Her lips were pressed together, thin and pale, as if sealing something behind them, something that would not be released. The faintest breath escaped her, a whisper so soft it could have been the rustle of dry paper. Agnes knelt beside her, the sound of her knees scraping against the stone floor filling the air like a small, guilty confession. "Please, sister, tell me." The bell tolled, a single chime, low and mournful, like a heartbeat that had not been heard in years. It came from somewhere within the chapel, a reverberation that shook the air itself. Agnes's chest tightened at the sound, and she looked at Lucille, whose face had gone deathly pale, her lips trembling as if she could feel the toll deep in her bones. The silence that followed the bell felt thicker than before, oppressive, as if it had weight, something that clung to them both, holding them in place. Agnes reached out, her fingers brushing Lucille's sleeve, and in that touch, she felt something tremble beneath her skin. Lucille's voice, when it finally came, was so soft it could barely be heard above the ringing in Agnes's ears. "Wasn't the fire," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the altar. "It wasn't the fire that took them." Agnes's heart skipped. "What do you mean? What happened?" Lucille's hand moved slowly, so slowly it seemed to ache with the effort. She pointed toward the altar, where the blackened remains of the holy relics lay scattered in the wreckage. "Bell," Lucille breathed. "The bell was never meant to ring. It was meant to hold them, to hold us all." Agnes's mind reeled, the words twisting in her thoughts like a dark prayer. She looked at the altar, then back at Lucille, whose eyes were wide with something that bordered on terror. But before Agnes could speak, the bell tolled again, louder this time, and somewhere, deep beneath the rubble, she could hear it clearly. The bell that never rang. The truth was buried under layers of stone and fire. But now, in the silence that followed, Agnes understood. They had never been meant to escape. The archive room smelled of decay, old paper, dust, and the faintest scent of something sweeter, like the last vestiges of incense, long burned away. Sister Agnes stood before the wooden shelves, their surfaces warped from the heat of the fire, the edges curling like the pages of a forgotten hymn. The archives had been untouched since the fire, and yet it was not the charred remnants of the convent that drew Agnes to this place, but the silence, the weight of secrets buried deeper than the ashes outside. The nuns had said nothing. They had not spoken of the fire. They had not spoken of anything. Their mouths remained closed, as though some terrible vow had sealed them shut. But Agnes, with each passing day, felt the gnawing ache of unanswered questions, and now, in this place, where the past lingered like a ghost, she might find an answer. She reached out, her fingers brushing the brittle spines of the old volumes. The fire had taken so much, yet it could not burn the words etched into these pages. Some things, it seemed, were meant to survive. She picked one from the shelf at random, a thin, yellowed bundle of letters bound together by a fraying string. The ink had faded with time, but the words were still legible. trembling whispers, as if afraid of being read. The first letter was dated 6 years before the fire. The handwriting was delicate, the loops and swirls of the letters carefully crafted, as if by a practiced hand. Sister Agnes sat down on the floor, the cold stone pressing against her knees as she opened the fragile sheet. "My dearest Lucille, how long it has been since I last saw you. The days stretch long between us, as if the convent's walls grow ever higher, ever thicker, keeping me from the one I love. My heart grows heavy, and I find myself praying more than I should, but the Lord does not answer. I pray not for forgiveness, but for strength, for I know what we share cannot be spoken, even to the darkness. Still, I wonder if you feel it too, this hunger, this need to be near you, to hold you, even if only for a moment." Agnes paused, her fingers trembling as they held the letter. She glanced around the room, the walls seeming to close in around her as the words bled into her mind. A forbidden love, hidden within the convent's walls, beneath layers of vows and silence. It was a thing she had not dared to imagine, not in the place where the sacred was meant to reign, where faith was meant to be pure. She set the letter aside and took another from the bundle. The second letter was written months later, the ink dark and bold. The words were sharper, more urgent. "Lucille, I cannot stand the distance between us any longer. The weight of it crushes me, and I fear my mind will crack if I do not see you soon. There are whispers in the halls. They speak of the bond we share, of the way we look at each other. I do not know who has noticed, but I am certain the others suspect. The Lady Abbess has been watching me closely. She knows I have been distracted. My prayers are not as devout as they should be, and my thoughts wander. My thoughts are always of you." Sister Agnes's heart stilled. The Lady Abbess, had she known? Had she suspected something, some unspoken bond between the two women? And what of the fire? Was this connection the cause of the ruin that had come to them all? She read on, her breath quickening as the words deepened, the ink seeping into the paper as if it were its own secret. The next letter was not so much a confession as it was a prayer for release. "Lucille, the time has come. I cannot bear it any more. There are moments when I feel the presence of the Lord slipping from me, as if his light grows dimmer with every passing day. We must end this before it consumes us entirely, before it consumes me." The words were broken, a jagged rhythm that reflected a mind unraveling. Agnes felt the weight of the sentence, the trembling ink, the fear in each curve of the letters. The forbidden relationship between the two women had not just been a bond, it had been a sin, something so dark that it had eaten away at their very faith. It had led them down a path from which there was no return. She opened the final letter, the last in the bundle, and found that the ink had almost entirely faded away. The words were faint, barely legible, but the message was clear enough. "The ritual must be performed. It is the only way to silence the voices. The others will never understand, but I know you do. This is the only way to be free." Sister Agnes's hand faltered as she clutched the letter, her pulse quickening. The ritual. What ritual? What had they done? The air in the room grew colder, and she could almost hear the whispers of the past creeping through the cracks in the walls. The silence of the convent had always been oppressive, but now, in the presence of these letters, it felt as though the very stones themselves held their breath. The secrets within these words were not meant to be uncovered. They were meant to stay buried, locked away in the dark corners of the convent where no one would think to look. Agnes could feel the pull of the words, the weight of guilt and fear that had haunted the nuns for years, and she knew, in her bones, that the fire had not been the only thing that had consumed them. There was something darker here, something that had festered beneath the surface of their vows, waiting to be unleashed. She stood, clutching the letters to her chest, and made her way to the small wooden desk by the window. The letters trembled in her hands as she set them down, the paper shaking like the fluttering of wings. The bell tolled again, distant but unmistakable, and this time Agnes did not ignore it. The bell had not ceased ringing since the fire, and now, in the silence of the room, she could almost hear it again, the toll of something lost, something buried in the ashes. Agnes knew now that she could never leave these letters behind. They were a part of her, a part of the convent, and a part of the secret that had torn it all apart. The ritual, the forbidden bond, the guilt, all of it was woven into the fabric of the place, a stain that could never be cleansed. The bell tolled, once more, and this time it was not distant. It was close, so close that she could feel it in the marrow of her bones. a single mournful chime, as if the very walls of the convent were calling her name. Agnes closed her eyes, and for the first time she heard the answer. The silence had never been empty, it had always been waiting. ChatGPT said. The air inside Sister Agnes's small, dimly lit chamber felt thick, as if it too had absorbed the silence of the convent, refusing to let it go. She sat by the window, the faint glow of the moon filtering through the grime-streaked glass, casting fractured shadows across the worn stone floor. The clock in the hall had long since stopped, its hands frozen at midnight. It was late for visitors, and yet the soft knock that came upon the door was undeniable. She stood, the movement slow, deliberate, as though drawn by an unseen force. There had been no sounds of life in the convent for days, no voices, no footsteps. The night had long since swallowed everything but the restless stir of her own thoughts. And yet there was a presence outside her door. She could feel it when she opened the door. She found Eliza standing in the threshold, her form hunched, as if bearing the weight of something too heavy to carry. The young nun's face was hidden beneath the heavy folds of her veil, her body draped in the grey habit that had once been a symbol of purity and devotion. Now it seemed to hang like a shroud around her, casting her figure into shadow. "Eliza," Agnes whispered, her voice catching in the quiet. Eliza did not respond immediately. She merely stood there, her shoulders trembling, as if undecided whether to enter or to turn and leave. The veil hung loosely over her face, hiding her features, and for a moment Agnes thought she might refuse her the chance to speak. Yet there was something in the way Eliza swayed on her feet that compelled Agnes to step aside and let her in. The door clicked shut behind them, the darkness in the room thickening, as though the walls themselves were leaning in. "Listening, I couldn't sleep," Eliza finally murmured, her voice hollow, as though it came from somewhere far away. She raised her hands, the fingers trembling, and adjusted the veil that shrouded her face even further. I thought I should come to you. I need to say something." Agnes's pulse quickened at the words, the unease settling over her like a second skin. She nodded, though her stomach twisted with dread. "Eliza, whatever it is," she began, her voice strained, "you can tell me. Whatever it is, you can." The young nun took a step forward, but instead of sitting, she sank to her knees. The sound of her habit rustling against the cold stone floor seemed unbearably loud in the heavy silence. Before the fire, Eliza began, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking the words aloud would make them real, would bring them to life in the very air around them. "Before the flames came, I saw things. In the chapel." Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, twisted into the folds of her habit. Agnes waited, every instinct urging her to ask more, to pull the truth from Eliza like a thread from a tapestry, unraveling, but there was something in the way Eliza hesitated that made her hold her tongue. "What did you see, Eliza?" Agnes asked, her voice quiet, coaxing. "What happened that night?" A long pause followed, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet rustling of the wind outside. Then, slowly, Eliza lifted her hands to her veil, her fingers trembling as they adjusted it again, pulling it tighter around her face. "The chanting," she whispered, her words coming in fragments, broken and jagged. "It was like a voice inside my head, a call, but not one from the Lord. It wasn't the voice of God." Agnes's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Eliza murmured, her voice cracking as if each word was a confession she could not bear. It was like the walls themselves were speaking, a sound so ancient, so. She trailed off, and for a moment the room seemed to close in on them, the shadows pressing tighter around them both. "I saw something, a figure, looming in the darkness." Sister Agnes felt a shiver run down her spine. "A figure?" Eliza nodded, her fingers gripping the fabric of her habit so tightly that her knuckles turned white beneath the veil. "It stood at the back of the chapel, just out of reach of the candlelight. And its presence, it felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be there. I don't know how to explain it, sister, but I swear, it was there." "Was it ... was it a person?" Agnes asked, leaning forward, her heart pounding with every word. "No," Eliza said, her voice growing strained. "It was something else, something ... dark. The shadows in the chapel, they seemed to shift, to breathe. The air itself grew thick, and we ... Eliza faltered, her breath shallow, before she whispered the next words, almost as though she were afraid they might escape into the room itself. We invited it. The words hit Agnes like a blow. What do you mean, invited it? Eliza's eyes were wide behind the veil, her hands trembling in her lap. We were desperate, we thought. We thought we could summon him, the one we had been praying for, but we called for something else. Something far darker. Her voice broke, and for the first time, she reached up, pulling the veil from her face. The action was slow, deliberate, as if revealing something that had been hidden for so long that the very act of exposing it was painful. Her face, once full of youth, was now gaunt, hollowed out by the weight of her own confession. Dark circles beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, of nights haunted by what she had seen. And yet, it was not her appearance that struck Agnes, but the hollowness in her gaze, the shadow of guilt that clung to her like a second skin. Who did you invite, Eliza? Agnes's voice was hoarse, torn between fear and sympathy. The young nun's lips parted, but the words never came. Instead, she collapsed forward, her hands pressed to her chest, her entire form trembling like a leaf in a storm. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with unspoken truths, as if the very room itself was waiting for the confession to be made. But it was too late. Eliza's words, though spoken, had never truly been heard. And in that silence, Agnes understood. The truth had been buried long ago, hidden beneath veils and shadows, where it could not be touched, could not be named. The bell tolled, distant but insistent, breaking the stillness with its mournful ring. The sound reached them both, vibrating through the stone walls, and Agnes knew, deep in her bones, that it was no longer just a sound. It was a warning. For the first time since the fire, she felt the weight of the past pressing upon her, suffocating her in its embrace. And she understood. Some things were never meant to be uncovered. Some veils were never meant to be lifted. The town of St. Augustine's Hollow had been hollowed long before the fire. In the weeks since, it seemed to have become a place of endless twilight, the pale sun barely cutting through the dense mists that clung to the hills. The silence of the convent, once a place of prayer and devotion, now felt like a tombstone, a quiet that crushed the very breath from Agnes's lungs. She walked among the people, the villagers who spoke in hushed tones, careful not to look her in the eye. Each passing day left her more unsettled, the pieces of the puzzle of that night slowly fitting together, but without clarity. The truth, if it was ever to be revealed, was bound up in the memories of those who had survived, and one of those survivors was Elias Becker. Agnes had first heard his name whispered behind closed doors, spoken with a mixture of reverence and dread. He had been the convent's spiritual advisor before his fall from grace. No one dared speak openly of him, not his sin, nor his redemption, nor his reasons for leaving. But now he had returned to the town, his presence a shadow in the streets, and Agnes felt the pull of his guilt as strongly as she felt the pull of her own. One evening, as the darkness bled into the town and the wind howled like the wailing of souls, Agnes found herself at the edge of the town square. The bell tower loomed in the distance, its skeleton still standing tall, a monument to destruction. The silence that surrounded it felt almost like a living thing, suffocating, yet she walked forward. There, standing beneath the heavy shadow of the old church, was Elias Becker. He was a man who had once stood before the altar, a man whose voice had once carried the weight of faith. Now, his shoulders slumped, his frame weary with age and sorrow. His clothes were threadbare, his priest's collar missing, replaced by a simple black coat that did nothing to disguise the guilt that clung to him like a second skin. Agnes approached him slowly, her steps careful, as though afraid the ground might open beneath her feet. She had seen him before, walking past the convent on the outskirts of town, but they had never spoken. This night, however, felt different. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. When he turned, his eyes met hers, and for a moment it felt as if time itself had paused. His eyes were deep, dark pools of regret, filled with an emptiness that mirrored her own. A flicker of recognition passed through his gaze, but he said nothing at first. "Father Elias," she asked quietly, her voice carrying over the quiet wind. He blinked, his expression distant, and then nodded. The briefest of motions, as though her words had not quite reached him. "Sister Agnes," he said, his voice low, ragged, as though it had not been used in years. "I thought you would come." She took another step closer, the sound of her feet scuffing against the stones like the rustle of leaves in a forgotten graveyard. "You have returned," she said, as much a question as a statement. "Some things are never meant to stay buried," he replied, his gaze dropping to the ground as he spoke. He shifted, his feet scraping the earth beneath him, and the faint sound of chains, or perhaps the whisper of prayer beads, seemed to echo in the wind. "What do you know of the fire?" Agnes asked, the question slipping from her lips without thinking. A question she had asked so many times already, but still had no answer to. Elias flinched, just slightly, but it was enough for Agnes to see it. His hands clenched at his sides, the muscles in his jaw tightening. For a long moment, he remained silent, as though the weight of her question was something too heavy to bear. "I know." His words trailed off. He turned his gaze to the horizon, as though the answer could be found in the darkness stretching out before them. "I know I failed them, all of them. I failed to see it, to stop it before it consumed them." Agnes's heart quickened, her chest tightening with the same unspoken fear she had felt ever since she'd uncovered the letters. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What was it? What happened in the chapel?" He exhaled, a heavy, sorrowful breath that seemed to draw the very air from the town. "It wasn't just the fire," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "It was them, the ones who had come before me, the ones who brought the darkness." The words hung between them, brittle and sharp, and Agnes's mind raced with unanswered questions. "The darkness," she repeated, her voice a faint echo. Of his dot, Elias nodded, his hands tightening once again, his fingers digging into his palms as though he were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. "The power," he said, his voice shaking, "the power they sought. It was never meant to be touched, but they called it to them, and it answered." Agnes felt the chill of his words seep into her bones. "The ritual," she murmured, piecing together the fragments of the letters, the whispers, the things the nuns would never say aloud. "The ritual that summoned something." He turned to face her fully, his expression one of both sorrow and shame. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible in the still night. "And it consumed them all. Consumed me. I was supposed to protect them, but I failed. We all failed." Elias's words settled over Agnes like a shroud, thick and suffocating. She took a step back, her mind reeling. The fire had not been an accident. The flames had not been a mere consequence of fate. The fire had been the culmination of something darker, something far beyond what she had ever imagined. "Why won't you tell me everything?" Agnes asked, her voice desperate, tinged with the raw need for truth. "Why can't you tell me? What happened in that chapel?" Elias's shoulders slumped, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. He closed his eyes, as if the very act of remembering was too much for him to bear. When he opened them again, his gaze was distant, haunted. "I can't," he whispered. "There are some things that should remain buried." His hands reached up, brushing against his own face in a gesture of helplessness, as if wiping away the memory that clung to him. "There are some things that should never be spoken aloud." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind howled, the sound of the world twisting, the trees bending beneath its weight. Agnes stood there, her heart pounding, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in her mind. But there was no answer, not one she could grasp, not one that would bring the truth into the light. Only darkness, and the faint, terrible chime of a bell that seemed to ring from somewhere deep beneath the earth. And in that moment, Sister Agnes realized that she, too, was a part of it now. Part of the darkness, part of the silence. There was no escaping it, and the flames had not yet burned away all that needed to be destroyed. The silence before the fire had been its own kind of storm. The days leading up to the inferno were heavy, with the scent of something unspeakable. It clung to the walls of the convent like a disease, an invisible rot that spread through the air, weaving itself into the hearts of the nuns, into their whispered prayers and broken hymns. There was something wrong, something festering beneath the surface, hidden in the shadowed corners of the chapel, behind the worn stone walls. In the cold crypt below, Sister Agnes had felt it before the fire, a tightening in her chest, a gnawing suspicion that there was something not right in the sacred space that had once been her refuge. The fire had not come out of nowhere, not truly. It was the end of something much older, a reckoning for what had been buried in the dark places beneath their vows. She had seen the signs. They had all seen them, but no one spoke of it, not even in the hushed tones shared between the most trusted. The crypt, forgotten by the townsfolk, had always been a place the nuns avoided, a place that smelled of damp earth, of mildew and age. No prayers had been spoken there in years. No light had ever reached those depths. Yet there were whispers, whispers of a ritual performed in secret, a thing too terrible to be known. The days passed, and with each, the walls of the convent seemed to grow heavier. The sisters, their voices softer now, exchanged glances, their faces shadowed, as though they could no longer look each other in the eye. They walked with the weight of something unsaid hanging between them, a shared guilt that no confession could erase. Even the bells seemed to mourn, their tolls no longer ringing clear and pure but muffled, as though they, too, were trying to hide something from the world. One evening, after Vespers, Sister Agnes approached Mother Hildegard, the eldest nun remaining in the convent. She had been there longer than any of the others, her presence as much a part of the convent as the stone walls and the cold, unforgiving crypt beneath. Mother Hildegard's face, once soft with the serenity of age, had become a mask of something else, something darker. There were days when she would sit motionless in the chapel, staring into the empty pews, her lips moving as if whispering to someone no one could see. "Sister Hildegard," Agnes asked quietly, stepping into the shadowed alcove where the older nun sat, "what happened? What was done in the crypt?" Mother Hildegard turned slowly, her eyes like faded embers, flickering with an understanding that frightened Agnes more than any shadow in the convent. "You already know, my child," she said, her voice soft, like the rustle of dried leaves. "You have always known." Agnes took a cautious step closer. The room seemed to close in around her, the flickering candlelight casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. "No," she whispered. "I need to know the truth. I must know." Mother Hildegard's lips twisted into something like a smile, but it was cold, distant. "The truth has been here long before you," she murmured. "It has always been. Here, in the very stones beneath your feet." Agnes felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. "Please, you must tell me. It is the only way to understand." The old nun's eyes closed for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts, or perhaps remembering something too terrible to speak. When she opened them again, the coldness was gone, replaced by a deep, sorrowful look that seemed to reach into Agnes's soul. "You will not hear the truth from me," Hildegard said softly, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "It is a thing buried too deep, too far gone to be resurrected by mere words. There are things, sister, that should never be spoken aloud. There are secrets that should never be unearthed." Agnes felt a tightening in her chest. "But what of the fire?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The fire that took them all, was it an accident?" Mother Hildegard's face twisted, her hands tightening around the folds of her habit, as if trying to stop something from escaping her. "The fire was not an accident, Agnes. It was a cleansing." Agnes recoiled, the words stinging like a slap. "Cleansing? Cleansing of what?" The old nun's eyes flicked to the floor, her lips pressed tight. She seemed lost in a memory that twisted her face with regret and something darker, of sin, of guilt, of things that should never have been. Sister Agnes's heart pounded. "What things? What did you do?" Mother Hildegard rose from her seat slowly, her movements deliberate, as though each step cost her something. She stood before the younger nun, her gaze distant, as though looking at something far beyond Agnes. "It was the ritual," she whispered, barely audible. "The one we performed in the crypt. The one that summoned the darkness, the shadows." In the room seemed to stretch longer, the air growing thick with something unseen. Agnes's breath hitched in her throat. "What do you mean? What darkness?" Mother Hildegard turned away, her hands shaking as she reached for the nearest prayer candle, her fingers brushing against the wick. "It was not a simple prayer," she said, her voice trembling. "We sought power. We sought absolution. But we were wrong. The thing we called forth, it was not the light we thought we were summoning. It was a shadow, and it has never left." The words fell like stones, heavy and unrelenting. Agnes's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of memory that had haunted her, the things that had always felt wrong about the convent, the secretive prayers, the shadows that seemed to watch from the corners, the coldness that clung to everything. You invoked it?" Agnes asked, her voice thick with disbelief. Mother Hildegard nodded, her eyes empty. "We thought we could control it. We thought we could make it our servant, but it consumed us instead. And when we realized what we had done, it was already too late." The room seemed to grow darker with her words, the walls pressing inward as if to swallow them both whole. The wind outside howled against the stone, and for the first time, Agnes felt as if the convent itself were alive with the guilt and horror of what had been done. And the fire. Agnes asked, her voice trembling. Was it part of the ritual? Yes, Hildegard whispered. It was the end of us, the end of all we had become. The fire was ... a baptism, a final purification. Agnes stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. A baptism in fire, she whispered, as the truth began to settle, cold and heavy, in her chest. A cleansing. She turned to leave, her mind spiraling into the abyss of what had been revealed. The crypt, the ritual, the darkness they had invoked. It was all part of something far greater than any of them could have ever understood, and the fire had been the final, inevitable consequence. That she stepped into the hall. The sound of bells rang, distant and hollow, a morning song that seemed to echo through the very bones of the convent, and Sister Agnes knew, deep in her heart, that some fires never truly burn out. They smoulder, waiting, beneath the surface. The ruins of the convent stood like a scar on the land, twisted remnants of what had once been a sanctuary. The moonlight, thin and pale, spilled over the crumbling stone walls, casting long skeletal shadows across the charred earth. It was as if the fire had not merely ravaged the building, but had stripped away the very soul of the place, leaving behind only the hollow echo of something lost. Sister Agnes stood at the edge of the ruins, her breath rising in a soft mist that mingled with the fog creeping from the forest. The silence around her felt too thick, as though the world itself had been suspended, holding its breath, waiting for something to break it. She had come here in the dead of night, drawn by a compulsion she could not explain, an ache in her chest that gnawed at her every waking moment. The letters, the whispers, the half-formed memories, they had led her here. She had to know. She had to understand. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with the scent of ash and earth. The trees surrounding the ruins were barren, their branches, like skeletal fingers reaching up toward the heavens, twisted in desperate supplication. But it was the ground beneath her feet that held her attention. She had seen something earlier, something small yet significant, a shape that had caught her eye, a flicker of movement in the shadows. She knelt, her hands trembling as she reached into the soot, her fingers brushing against something cold and waxy. At first, she thought it was just a piece of debris, perhaps a candle lost in the rubble. But as her fingers closed around it, she felt a jolt of recognition and fear. The shape was wrong, twisted, a grotesque figure, warped and malformed, its features half-formed and indistinct. She held it up, squinting in the dim light, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a figure she had seen before, not in the waking world, but in the dreams and visions that had plagued her since the fire. A figure that had appeared in the letters, a symbol of something that lurked just beyond the reach of her understanding. A candle, melted and deformed, its wax twisted into the shape of an unsettling face, its features half-formed and half-melted into the form of something inhuman. The figure was like an animal, yet human in its proportions, its body contorted in unnatural positions. Its eyes were black holes, empty and hollow, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The very sight of it sent a cold shiver down her spine. It was not just a figure, it was a symbol, a mark of something ancient and evil. Sister Agnes stood up slowly, her pulse quickening, the candle clutched tightly in her hand. She could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her, thick with a presence that was not quite physical. It was as if the very earth beneath her feet had absorbed the darkness of the fire, of the ritual, of the secrets buried here. The ruins seemed to close in around her, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, not by the eyes of the living, but by something older, something far more ancient. She could hear her own breath, shallow and rapid, as it echoed in the stillness, mingling with the faint whispers of something that seemed to reach into her mind, into her very soul. With a final glance at the twisted candle in her hand, Agnes turned toward the entrance of the crypt, hidden beneath the rubble. The stone steps that led down into the earth were slick with dampness, their edges crumbling, but she stepped forward, the compulsion to go deeper into the heart of the convent growing stronger with every passing second. The path seemed familiar, as if it had always been waiting for her, as though the crypt had always known she would come. The cold grew more intense as she descended, the air growing heavy with an unnatural chill. The shadows seemed to stretch, longer, wrapping around her like a shroud. The crypt was not simply a tomb, it was a place of oppression, a place where something dark and malevolent had taken root. The walls were covered in symbols, drawn in melted wax, dark and thick, their shapes indecipherable, but their meaning clear. They were not marks of prayer or devotion. They were marks of something else, something forbidden, something primal. Sister Agnes moved deeper into the crypt, her hands trembling as she traced the waxen symbols with her fingertips. She could feel the chill of the wax against her skin, a cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. The air felt heavier now, pressing against her chest, as though the walls were closing in. She could hear nothing but the sound of her own breath and the faint rustling of the wind outside. But there was something else, something she could not place, a presence that lingered just at the edge of her consciousness, that as she moved further into the crypt, her mind racing with the questions that had plagued her for so long, she felt it, a coldness, an unshakable feeling of being watched, of being judged. Her heart beat faster, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But there was nothing, only the oppressive silence, the darkness pressing in around her. And then she saw it, at the far end of the crypt, in the deepest corner, a faint light flickered, casting eerie shadows against the walls. It was the faintest glow, barely visible, but it was there, beckoning her closer. She felt an almost irresistible pull, her legs moving toward it of their own accord, her mind too clouded with fear to question the compulsion. The closer she got, the colder it became, and the whispering grew louder, as though the very stones were speaking to her, urging her on. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift, their waxen forms twisting and warping before her eyes. She could not make sense of them, but she knew, deep down, that they were not meant to be understood. They were meant to be felt. And then she reached the source of the light. It was a small candle, flickering weakly in the corner, its wax melting in a pool beneath it. The candle was strangely familiar, its shape identical to the one she had found above, but this one was different. This one was not twisted or grotesque. This one was whole, and yet there was something wrong about it, something about its flickering flame that seemed out of place in the dead silence of the crypt. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing the wax. The warmth of the flames seemed to surge through her, filling her with a sensation that was not entirely unpleasant. But as her hand closed around the candle, a voice, a whisper, soft and almost inaudible, filled her mind. "You should not have come." The words froze her in place, her heart pounding in her chest. She spun around, her eyes searching the shadows. But there was nothing, no one, just the darkness, and the weight of a presence she could not escape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she understood, with a sudden, terrible clarity, that she had been led here for a reason, not to find answers, but to become part of the story, to become one with the darkness that had consumed this place long ago. As she turned to leave, the candle flickered out. The crypt was swallowed by darkness, and the whispers followed her, curling around her like the fingers of the dead. And Sister Agnes knew, with a certainty that sank deep into her bones, that some things could never be left behind. The silence in the convent had become suffocating, an ever-present weight that pressed on Agnes with each passing day. The once sacred halls, now nothing more than hollow corridors of stone and soot, whispered their secrets through the cracks in the walls. The fire had not merely ravaged the building, it had hollowed out the souls of those who had lived there, leaving behind only shadows and echoes. Agnes's investigation, once filled with hope for answers, had now become a search for something else, something darker. Each step she took in the ruin of the convent felt like an intrusion, like a violation of the stillness that had settled so thickly in the air. It was as if the place itself was alive, breathing in silence, waiting for her to leave. But she could not yet. The nuns, those few who had survived, had grown quieter in the days since the fire. They spoke in fragmented sentences, as though their voices were too fragile to carry the weight of words. When they did speak, it was not of the fire or the things they had witnessed. Instead, they whispered of dreams, vivid, unshakable dreams, of children they had lost, of vows they had once made and broken. Their voices would catch on the air like the flutter of dying wings, fading before the truth could be grasped. And yet, they refused to speak of what had happened that night. They had all lost something, but it was as though they feared that to speak of it would bring the truth into the light, something that would burn them once more. Agnes had been to them, or Sister Lucille, whose hollow eyes spoke of a grief too deep to name, Sister Beatrice, whose hands trembled as she prayed in silence, and Mother Hildegard, whose lips never moved but whose eyes burned with a feverish, almost desperate knowing. Each encounter left her feeling more like an intruder than a seeker. of truth. Their silence surrounded her, cocooning her in a web of guilt, of something unsaid, something buried beneath layers of ash and prayer. This evening, she had come to find Sister Beatrice, who had not been seen for several days. The older nun had withdrawn even further into herself, her habit now more shadow than fabric, as if she had become one with the gloom that now filled the convent. The hallways stretched long before Agnes, the flickering light of her candle casting strange shadows on the walls. The faint scent of burnt wood still lingered, a ghost of the fire that had claimed everything, leaving only the charred remnants. Behind Dot, as Agnes approached Sister Beatrice's room, the door stood slightly ajar, the dim light from within spilling out like a pool of water, too still to be disturbed. She hesitated, a knot tightening in her stomach. But she had to know. She had to hear what they were all refusing to say. She pushed the door open slowly. The room was cold, unnaturally so, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the chill of the crypt. Sister Beatrice sat by the window, staring out into the night, her face pale and drawn. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers twitching slightly, as though they were still trying to grasp something. "Beatrice," Agnes said softly, stepping inside. Her voice echoed in the emptiness, but the older nun did not turn to face her. "Sister, it's me. I need to understand. I need to know what happened." Beatrice's lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes, glazed and distant, were fixed on the moonlit sky outside. Agnes moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. At the sight of the other woman's trembling hands, "They come to me," Beatrice whispered, her voice as thin as the air around them. "The children, ... they call to me." Her voice trembled, breaking under the weight of something long buried. "In the fire, they came. I heard their cries, but I could not save them." Agnes's heart clenched. "The fire," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking it aloud might awaken something worse. "What did you see, Beatrice?" Beatrice finally turned, her eyes dark with something more than sorrow, something ancient and heavy. "I saw them," she murmured. "I saw the faces of the children, twisted, melted, ... like the candle in the chapel. They were not ... not human anymore." Agnes felt a shiver crawl down her spine. "What do you mean? What happened?" Beatrice's lips parted again, but no words came. She looked at Agnes with eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing all at once. And then, finally, she spoke. "We were wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "We summoned something that shouldn't have been. The fire WASN, single quotes T ... an accident. It was the reckoning, the punishment." Agnes felt her legs weaken beneath her. The weight of the words was too much to bear, too much to comprehend. She had known, deep down, that something had been hidden from her, something darker than the flames that had consumed the convent. She had thought it was just the fire, just the destruction. But now, she understood that the fire had been something more, a cleansing, a final act of vengeance. "And the children?" Agnes asked, her voice thick with dread. Beatrice's gaze dropped to the floor. "They were the cost, the price we paid." Agnes's breath caught in her throat. "The price?" Beatrice nodded slowly, her fingers twitching again, as though something inside her could not sit still. "We tried to call something we thought it would save us, but we were wrong. And it took them. It took us, all of us." A long silence hung between them, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Agnes stepped back, her hand pressed against her chest, feeling the coldness seep into her bones. The sound of the bells echoed in the distance, faint and hollow, as though they had been struck by hands that no longer cared for them. Agnes's pulse quickened. The bell that had rung even when there was no one left to answer it. It tolled again, its mournful sound stretching across the empty town like a call to something long buried. "Sister Beatrice," Agnes whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "What did you see? What did the fire truly take?" Beatrice's eyes flickered, a brief flash of something too terrible to describe. "It wasn't just our lives," she whispered. "It took our souls. It took everything. And now it waits." Agnes turned and fled the room, her breath ragged, her heart pounding as the dark shadows of the convent closed in around her. The fire had not been the end. It had been the beginning of something worse. The silence grew, its grip tightening with each passing moment, and Agnes could feel it, something watching her, something that had never been fully consumed by the flames. The fire had left a seed, a terrible seed that would never die, and as she moved through the crumbling halls, The silence echoed louder than ever before. The sky had long since darkened, and the winds that swept through St. Augustine's Hollow carried with them a chill that seemed to echo the horrors that had taken root in the heart of the convent. The town itself had become a shadow, a place where even the sun struggled to break through the ever-present veil of fog. Agnes stood at the edge of the ruins, her breath rising in soft tendrils that mingled with the fog, and she felt the weight of the past pressing down on her like the very stones beneath her feet. The truth was, there somewhere deep within the ruins, but she could not yet reach it. Elias Becker had not returned to the convent since the night of the fire. His reappearance in town had been brief, a passing figure in the fog, but now, as Agnes made her way through the town square, she saw him. He was standing by the old well, the moonlight casting a pallid glow on his face, his eyes hollow with a sorrow too deep to name. When he saw her, he did not flinch, nor did he look away. He merely stood, waiting. Agnes's heart quickened in her chest as she approached him, the weight of everything she had learned pressing upon her. The nuns' silence, the cryptic symbols, the dreams and the whispers, it had all led her here, to him. Elias had been the spiritual guide of the convent, and yet it was his actions, his decisions, that had led them all to this place, to the fire, to the sins that had been buried beneath the ashes. "You came," Elias said softly, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "I knew you would." Agnes did not speak at first. She simply stood before him, her heart thrumming in her chest, the words she had rehearsed in her mind now lost in the fog. She had questioned so many questions, but all she could ask was the one that had lingered for so long. "The fire," she whispered. "What happened? What was it?" Elias sighed, a long, slow exhale that seemed to carry the weight of years. He stepped away from the well, his hands folding together, his head bowed as if in some final prayer. "You know," he said softly, almost to himself, "you have always known, sister, but you could never understand, not until now." Agnes took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. "Tell me." Elias lifted his gaze, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes, something beyond sorrow. It was guilt, deep and unrelenting, a thing that had gnawed at his soul for far too long. "It wasn't an act of God," he said, his voice low, but clear, as though he had been waiting to speak these words for years. The fire was not a punishment, it was a decision, a choice made by those who believed they had no other way to cleanse the horrors they had unleashed. Agnes blinked, her mind struggling to grasp his meaning. "What horrors? What do you mean?" Elias looked down at his hands, his fingers curling as if remembering something long buried. "I was the one who brought it here," he whispered. "I made a promise, a vow to protect a hidden truth, a truth that should never have been allowed to live. It was my fault." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. Agnes stepped closer, her voice trembling with both fear and disbelief. "You brought something. What did you bring?" Elias's eyes flickered with something that was almost fear, but he did not look away. "It wasn't supposed to be this way. We thought we could control it, sister. We thought we could protect the convent, but the darkness, the power we saw took root. It grew beneath the chapel, beneath our vows, beneath everything we believed. And once it was there, once we had summoned it, there was no turning back." Agnes's hands trembled at her sides. As the words sank in, she had heard whisper stories of rituals and symbols, of the crypt beneath the chapel, of things that had been done in desperation. But now, standing before Elias, hearing him speak these things aloud, they felt like a weight she could not bear. You summoned it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias nodded slowly. "We thought we could bring salvation. We thought we could control it. But the power we called forth was never meant to be tamed. It was never meant to be a tool. It was a force of destruction. And when it took hold of us, there was nothing left to do but to burn it away." Agnes's breath caught in her throat. "The fire," she whispered. "The fire was meant to destroy it." "Yes," Elias said, his voice thick with sorrow. "The fire was our only hope. We set it alight to burn away the corruption that had taken root within the convent, to cleanse it, to rid it of the evil we had invited into our midst. But it didn't work. The fire, it didn't burn everything away." Agnes's mind spun as the truth unfolded before her. The fire had not been an accident. It had been a desperate act, a decision made by those who believed it was the only way to atone for the sins they had committed. It had been an attempt to purge the evil they had brought into the world. But even in their desperation, they had failed. "And the children?" Agnes whispered, her heart aching with the knowledge of something she had always suspected, but had never been able to confirm. What happened to them? Elias's face twisted with guilt. He closed his eyes as if he could not bear to see her, to speak the words that had haunted him for so long. "They were the price," he said softly. "We tried to call upon something that should never have been. The ritual, it was meant to bring salvation, but instead it brought death. And the children," his voice cracked, and he stopped, unable to continue. Agnes felt something cold settle in her chest, a realization that gripped her like a vice. She had always wondered what had really happened in the convent, what had driven those who had survived to remain silent, to withdraw into themselves. Now she understood. The fire had not been just a result of the evil they had summoned. It had been their attempt to destroy it, to cleanse their sins, but their sins were not so easily erased. "Is that why you left?" Agnes asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sympathy. "Is that why you abandoned us all? Because you couldn't live with the guilt?" Elias met her gaze, his eyes filled with a sorrow too deep to speak. "I left because there was nothing left for me to do. The damage had been done. The evil had taken root, and there was no place for me in the convent after that. No place for any of us. I thought leaving would make it easier, but it didn't. I was wrong." The night around them seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up as if echoing the brokenness between them. The bell tolled in the distance, its mournful chime filling the empty air. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The truth had been laid bare between them, a truth that would never be undone. The convent had fallen, not because of some divine punishment, but because of the choices they had made. The fire had not been the end. It had been the beginning of something darker, something that could never be erased. Agnes felt the weight of it, all the sins they had buried, the promises they had made, the lives lost in the flames, and she wondered if there was any redemption left for them. For her, as the wind howled and the bell tolled again, she knew one thing for certain. Some fires never burn out. They linger, they smolder, waiting for the moment when they will rise again. The convent was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears like a weight too heavy to bear. The halls, once echoing with the soft murmur of prayers, now seemed hollow. Their stones, weary from years of secrets, whispered within their walls. The fire, though now just a memory of blackened ash, still clung to everything, the air, the walls, the hearts of those who had survived. The ghosts of the past lingered, thick and oppressive, and the truth seemed just out of reach, always slipping further into the shadows. Agnes had spoken to all the others, the nuns, the ones who had seen, who had survived, but there was one who had remained silent, hidden away from the others. Madeleine, a young novice, barely more than a girl, her face always veiled in quiet reserve. She had been there that night. She had seen it all, yet she had said nothing. She had remained in the background, a shadow among shadows, as the older nuns spoke in half-formed words and whispered confessions. But tonight, as Agnes wandered the cold halls once more, searching for the final thread that would unravel the truth, she found her. Madeleine was seated in a small corner of the convent's chapel, her eyes fixed on the crumbling altar, her hands trembling as they twisted a prayer bead between her fingers. The candlelight flickered weakly, casting the room in soft, trembling shadows. Agnes approached her slowly, her steps hesitant, as if the very air in the chapel held its breath. "Madeleine," Agnes whispered, her voice breaking the stillness. "Madeleine, I need to hear from you. What happened that night? You've been silent through it all." The young novice did not respond at first. Her eyes remained locked on the altar, her fingers still moving mechanically over the beads. A nervous twitched in the way they moved. Agnes felt the pull of something unsaid, something buried beneath the surface of her silence. She waited. Finally, Madeleine spoke, her voice barely a whisper, thick with fear. "I saw it first," she said, her gaze lifting to meet Agnes's. Her eyes were wide, hollow, as though she had not slept in days. "I saw the flame." Agnes's heart stilled, a chill creeping through her. "The flame? You saw it before?" "The fire." Madeleine nodded, a tremor running through her. "I was in the convent, alone. I thought I heard someone calling. I followed the sound, through the halls, down the stairs. It was so cold, sister, so cold. But then I saw it, just a flicker at first, a little light, dancing at the edge of the hallway. But it wasn't from a candle, and it wasn't from any lamp. She paused, as if trying to gather the strength to continue. It was something ... alive. Agnes felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She stepped closer to Madeleine, her voice low. "What do you mean, alive?" Madeleine's hands clenched tightly around the prayer beads, her knuckles white. "I don't know." It was like the light had a life of its own, a presence, a hunger. "And I tried to tell someone. I went to Sister Beatrice, but no one would listen. They said I was imagining it, but I knew what I saw. I saw the flame, burning bright in the dark." Agnes's breath hitched, and her gaze flickered to the crumbling altar, the very same altar where the rituals had taken place. The flame, Madeleine had seen it, had not been just a flicker of light. It had been something more, something that had come from within the convent itself. "And no one believed you?" Agnes asked, her voice strained. "No one took you seriously?" Madeleine shook her head, her eyes distant. "They didn't believe me. They thought I was just ... nervous, but I saw it. It was coming from the walls, from the stones themselves, like the building was alive, burning from the inside out." She took a sharp breath, and then ... the fire. "It came from the chapel, but not like we thought." Agnes's mind raced, her pulse quickening. She had heard the rumors, the whispers, of rituals, of things done in secret. But now, it was all becoming clear. The fire had not been an accident. The fire had been the culmination of something much darker. The fire wasn't God's punishment, was it? Agnes's voice trembled as she spoke the words aloud, the thought forming in her mind as she heard them. "No," Madeleine whispered, her voice breaking. "It wasn't. It was us. We did this. We brought it to life. The fire. It was a consequence. The flame. It wasn't meant to be put out." Agnes took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. The pieces were falling into place, but they were not the pieces she had expected. The fire had not been a cleansing, as some of the nuns had believed. It had been the end of something, the inevitable result of a thing that had been set in motion, long before the flames had ever touched the convent. You're saying the fire was caused by what we did, what you did." Agnes's voice faltered, and she had to steady herself against the stone wall. Madeleine's eyes were wide with guilt, her hands trembling in her lap. "We all thought we could control it, sister. We thought we could contain it, but it ... it was never meant to be contained. The fire was the only way we knew to stop it, to stop what had been unleashed. But it wasn't enough. It will never be enough." Agnes took a shaky breath. The truth, as it came from Madeleine's trembling lips, felt like a death sentence. A death sentence not just for the convent, but for all of them. The fire had not come to destroy what was evil. It had come to destroy what they had allowed to grow. They had summoned something that could never be extinguished by flames. "So, it wasn't an accident," Agnes said, her voice barely more than a whisper. You didn't just burn the convent, you summoned the fire, and now it's here. It's inside us. It always has been." Madeleine's face twisted with horror, her hands clutching the prayer beads as if they were the only thing holding her together. "I tried to warn them, sister. I tried, but no one would listen. And now ... now it's too late. It's too late. For us all." Agnes's mind reeled, the weight of the confession settling over her like a shroud. The nuns, the convent, the firit, had all been a consequence of choices made in desperation, of sins buried too deeply to ever be forgiven. They had all been complicit in this, had all allowed the darkness to grow, and now there was no escaping it. As Madeleine's confession hung in the air, the chapel seemed to grow colder. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the stone walls, and the faintest sound like the faint echo of bells drifted through the silence. Agnes turned her gaze to the altar, her thoughts swirling in a storm of guilt and fear. She had come here for answers, but now she understood. There was no answer, only the echoes of their sins, the fires they had set, and the knowledge that nothing could ever undo what had been done. And as the wind howled outside, Agnes knew that no one, least of all herself, could ever escape the consequences of their actions. The fire had not been the end, it was only the beginning. The flame would never die, it would only wait, and now it watched them all. The moon hung heavy and full, casting pale light through the broken windows of the convent, like a ghost that refused to leave. The air in the chapel was thick with the scent of old incense and the musty dampness of the stone walls. Yet there was something else in the air, something more insidious that clung to the very stones beneath Agnes's feet. She could feel it now, a shudder in the walls, an echo in the floorboards. It was as if the convent itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold, something it had long been waiting for. The town, so oblivious in its stillness, slept unaware of the ritual that continued within these walls. Agnes stood in the chapel, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes tracing the faint light of the candles that flickered along the walls. She had come here to end this, to confront the truth that had haunted her for so long, but the closer she came to the heart of it, the more she realized the truth could never be undone. The fire had not been the end of the darkness. It had only been the beginning. The nuns had long since stopped speaking of the fire, of the things that had come before and after it. They had withdrawn into their prayers, into rituals that no longer carried the weight of faith, but rather the weight of guilt that bled through the cracks in their voices. But it was the muttering of their prayers that Agnes could not escape, the constant whisper of their recitations in the dead of night. She had come to believe, in her final days here, that these prayers were not just for atonement, but for something darker, something they sought to bury. Their voices, once ringing with hymns of devotion, now murmured names in the dark, the names of those lost to the fire, to the shadows, to the unspoken sins. It was as though their prayers were the last tether to a world that had long since been swallowed by silence. Agnes had heard them, to whispers from Sister Lucille, from Sister Beatrice, from the others, who spoke only in fragments of memory, as if the act of remembering was as painful as the act of breathing. They said things in their sleep, things they could never say while awake. They spoke of children lost, burned beyond recognition. They spoke of a presence that had always been there, that had been waiting for them. They spoke of the flame, not as a punishment, but as a reckoning that was never truly finished. The chapel was colder now, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper with every passing second. The stained glass windows, once vibrant with color, were now dull, their images muted and fractured by soot and ash. The flickering candlelight cast long, twisted shadows that danced along the walls like broken memories. Agnes could almost hear the faintest sound of chains rattling in the silence, like the clinking of prayer beads or, perhaps, the chains of guilt, which had bound the nuns to their fate long before the fire had consumed them. In the back of the chapel, near the altar, the nuns were gathered silent figures cloaked in shadow, their heads bowed as if in prayer, their hands clasped in the same familiar gesture. But their eyes, though closed, were not truly shut. They were waiting, watching, even in their silence. They were bound to something beyond the walls. Agnes could feel their presence in the room, could feel the weight of their prayers pressing down upon her, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her core, that these were not prayers for forgiveness. These were prayers for protection. Protection from the very thing they had unleashed. Protection from the fire that had not burned away their sins, but had merely sealed them within. The fire was the beginning, not the end. As Agnes approached them, her footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should, as though the walls themselves were listening. The nuns did not move, did not acknowledge her presence. They simply continued their whispered prayers, the sound of their voices rising and falling like the tide, repeating the same words over and over. Sister Lucille, the youngest, was at the front of the group, her face obscured by the shadow of her veil. But even in that shadow, Agnes could see the tremble in her hands, the twitch of her fingers as they clutched the rosary beads. She had not spoken in weeks, but her silent presence was enough to convey the weight of the past. Agnes stepped forward, her heart racing. She could feel it now, the oppressive silence that threatened to consume her. The words of the prayers grew louder, as if the chapel itself was breathing them into the very air. She was standing at the edge of something she could never unsee, something that had been buried here, in the dark corners of the convent, for far too long. "Why do you continue?" Agnes asked, her voice breaking the rhythm of their prayers. "Why do you keep praying?" Sister Lucille's head jerked up, her eyes wide with something between fear and recognition. She stared at Agnes for a moment, her lips trembling. Before she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Because we must," Lucille said, her eyes dark and hollow. "Because if we do not, it will come for us. It will never stop." "What will come for you?" Agnes asked, stepping closer. Her mind reeled, trying to grasp the meaning behind her words. "What have you done?" Lucille's hand reached out, trembling as it hovered just above the altar, her fingers grazing the edges of the old prayer book. "We didn't know what we were calling. We didn't know that it would stay." "Stay," Agnes repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "What are you saying? What is it?" But Lucille didn't answer. Her gaze moved beyond Agnes, toward the dark corners of the chapel, her eyes fixed on something that Agnes could not see, something that had always been there, hiding just out of reach. The other nuns continued their prayers, their voices growing, louder now, as though they were summoning something, or perhaps pleading for it to stay hidden, for the darkness to remain locked behind the walls. Agnes felt it then, a cold, palpable presence creeping through the room, swirling around her like smoke, like a shadow too deep to escape. The walls seemed to close in, the chapel's air growing heavier, more suffocating with each passing breath. The candlelight flickered, casting monstrous shadows across the altar, where the twisted figures of the nuns knelt, their heads bent low in submission. It was not a prayer, they whispered. It was a plea, a desperate plea to something they could no longer control. And then, in the silence that followed, it came. A sound, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, the faint crackle of flame. Agnes froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned toward the altar, and for a moment, she could see it, a flicker, a spark, the beginning of something too terrible to comprehend. The fire had never truly died. It had merely been waiting for them to acknowledge it, waiting for them to open the door once more. The chapel was suffocating now, the air thick with smoke. The flames, though small, were there, and Agnes knew, in that moment, that the darkness they had tried to bury was alive. It was waiting, and there was no escape. The fire had not been the end of their sins. It had only been the beginning. The flame would burn forever, and so would they. The ruins of the convent stood still beneath a heavy sky, the very air pregnant with the kind of silence that only centuries of guilt could bring. The wind had stopped howling. The usual rustle of leaves in the distance quieted as though the world itself had paused in anticipation. And yet, within those crumbling walls, something stirred. A presence too heavy to ignore, too thick to breathe through, lingered. The fire that had once reduced the convent to ash had not been the end of them. It had only been the beginning. Sister Agnes stood in the heart of the chapel, now little more than a broken shell of what it had been. The altar, blackened and scarred, was a cruel reminder of the past. The stained glass windows, their vibrant colors faded to melancholy hues, cast fractured patterns on the floor. The flickering of a single candle illuminated her face, its wavering light revealing a mixture of horror, defiance, and resignation. The air was cold, biting, and she could feel it, the same coldness she had felt the night she first ventured into the crypt. Only now, it was worse. It was as though the very chapel itself was turning against her, turning against them all. The remaining nuns were gathered around her, their faces hidden beneath their veils, their hands folded in prayer. They had become little more than shadows, their once strong voices reduced to weak mutterings. But their prayers had changed. They no longer asked for forgiveness. Now, they only whispered the names of those they had lost, their voices carrying an echo of terror, of resignation. Sister Lucille, whose hands trembled as they clutched a rosary, stood beside her. There was no longer any trace of the bright-eyed novice who had once been full of hope. The fire had stripped them all of their faith, of their strength. And now, as they stood in the remnants of their once sacred place, they knew that there was no salvation to be found here. Agnes's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of everything that had been uncovered pressing against her ribs like a vice. The fire, the darkness, the sins, they had not gone away. They had only been waiting for this moment. The distant tolling of the bell echoed from the town square, the sound distant yet distinct. The town, so unaware of the horrors that still festered within the convent's walls, would never understand what had happened. They would never know that this town's history was forever bound to the flames, to the darkness they had all failed to extinguish. Sister Agnes closed her eyes for a brief moment, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across the ruins of the chapel. She could feel it now, the presence that had lingered, the fire that had never truly died, now awakening in the very air around her. The flame that had once ravaged this place was not gone. It had been waiting, and now it was coming for them. All the walls seemed to creak, as if the building itself was stretching, awakening, yearning to consume them once again. Agnes opened her eyes, the realization hitting her like a bolt of lightning. The fire had never left. It had simply been lying in wait, dormant in the ashes, waiting for the moment when it would rise again. She took a step back, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "We are not safe," she whispered, her voice breaking the prayerful murmurs of the others. "The fire... It's not gone. It has returned." The nuns stirred, their heads turning toward her, their expressions veiled in confusion and fear. But Agnes could see the truth of it in their faces. They, too, knew. They, too, could feel the return of the flame, the return of the thing they had once summoned, the thing they had tried so desperately to bury. The candle's flame flickered wildly, as if in warning. The faintest warmth began to rise from the floor, spreading through the chapel like a slow burn, rising from the stone, from the very earth beneath their feet. The walls groaned in protest, as if the chapel itself could no longer contain what had been unleashed. And then it came, not as fire, not in flames of orange and red, but as something worse, a shadow, dark and thick, coiled around them like smoke, swirling through the air. It moved, not like a living thing, but like something hungry, something ancient, something too old to die. It was as though the very chapel had absorbed it, had absorbed their guilt, their sins, their desperation. And now it was alive, waiting to claim them. Agnes's heart skipped a beat, and she turned to face the nuns. They were no longer praying. Their eyes were wide, vacant, as though they had been swallowed by the darkness, as though they had already given in to whatever had returned. Sister Lucille's lips moved soundlessly, and Agnes could see her shaking, could see her trembling beneath the weight of something unseen. It's here," Lucille finally gasped. "It's here to take us." The shadow grew thicker, darker, and for the first time since the fire, Agnes felt the weight of the truth she had uncovered settle upon her like a tombstone. There would be no escape from this. There never had been. The fire had not burned them away, had not cleansed them. It had only marked the beginning of something far worse. And now, it was coming for them all. Agnes took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand tall, to face the inevitable. Her body trembled, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "We must face it. We must face what we have done." The shadow recoiled, as if reacting to her words, and the temperature in the chapel dropped, the air growing thick with the presence of something too terrible to name. The walls groaned once again, the very foundations shaking beneath their feet. The bell tolled once more, but this time it was not distant. It was close to close, as if the sound itself was being born from the darkness itself. The flame had never died. It had simply been waiting for them to call upon it once more. And then, a voice, barely audible, drifted through the room. No one's voice, yet it seemed to come from everywhere. "You called me." The nuns cowered, their hands clutching at their veils, their eyes wide with terror. But Agnes remained standing, her eyes fixed on the darkness that swirled before her. She felt the weight of their sins pressing down upon her, the guilt of everything that had led them here. But even as she felt the terror grip her chest, she knew, deep down, that she could not escape what they had summoned. They had called it, and now it would take them as the flame that was not a flame rose from the earth, consuming them all. Agnes's last thought was not of fear, but of regret. She had thought the fire was the end, but it had never been the end. It was only the beginning, and now there would be no escape. The town of St. Augustine's Hollow had become a place of muted life, the echo of its past seeping into every crevice of its now rebuilt streets. The houses were new, their walls unmarked by soot or history, and the town square once again hummed with the simple sounds of daily life. Children ran in the streets, their laughter sweet but somehow hollow, as if the land beneath their feet held a memory far older than their joy. But there was something else, something that lingered just beyond the borders of the town, a presence that the people did not speak of, yet could not forget. The convent had been rebuilt, too, though it was little more than a shell now. The place that had once been a sanctuary, a symbol of faith and devotion, was now a hollowed ruin, its walls standing mute, as if they had no more prayers to offer. The nuns, those who had survived, still walked its halls, but they were shadows, now, veiled figures who moved like ghosts through the corridors of their own penitence. They had become nothing more than echoes of the past, their voices lost to the silence they had once created. No one spoke of them anymore, and no one dared to ask. They were forgotten by the town, left to wander the empty spaces between the walls, performing their penance in silence. But their silence was not the same as peace. It was a silence born of guilt, of something that could never be washed clean. The echoes of the fire, of the rituals that had burned the very soul of the convent, still lingered in the air. and they, the surviving nuns, knew it as much as anyone. The land had been stained, and though the physical scars had faded with the rebuilding, the deeper wound remained, the sin that had never been fully confessed. And so, they walked in silence. Agnes's name had long since faded from the town's memory, swallowed by the thick fog of time and shame. She had become a whisper, a legend whispered among the few who still remembered, but even that memory was fragile, like the smoke from the fire that had long since dissipated into the night. Some said she had disappeared, others claimed she had left the town, unable to live with the weight of what had transpired. Few knew the truth, and fewer still dared to ask, but Agnes's story had never truly ended. It lived on in the whispers, in the way the town held its breath, whenever the wind shifted, whenever the bells tolled at midnight. It lived in the empty chapel, in the silent prayers of the remaining nuns, who knelt before the broken altar, as if their devotions might somehow undo what they had done. The chapel, like the town, had been rebuilt. The stone floor, the charred beams, all replaced by new wood and new stone. But even in its renewed state, it carried something that could not be fixed. The windows, now free of soot, still cast the same fragmented light across the room, and the shadows, those long, sharp shadows, still clung to the walls. It was as though the chapel, no matter how much it was rebuilt, could not forget what had happened there. In the far corner of the chapel, Sister Lucille stood, her hands folded. In front of her, eyes closed. Her veil was darker now, heavier, as though the weight of it was an attempt to shield her from something she could not face. The quiet that surrounded her was thick, almost tangible. She had never truly recovered from that night. No one had. The remaining nuns gathered in the shadows, their faces hidden, as they prayed not for absolution, but for protection, for something to take the weight of their silence and their guilt. They could not speak, could not confess, for they knew that their sins were not the kind that could be washed away by prayer alone. The fire, the darkness they had invoked, it had taken more than their voices. It had taken their very souls, and, as the chapel filled with the murmurs of their prayers, Agnes's spirit seemed to drift in the air above them, not a ghost, but something far more enduring. Her presence was in the silence, in the way the walls seemed to pulse with the unspoken, in the way the candlelight flickered and cast long shadows, as if it too feared the truth of what had happened. Outside, the town lay still, unaware of the burden carried within the convent's walls. The streets were bright with lanterns, the laughter of children filling the night, and the distant sound of music drifted in from the town square. The people moved on with their lives, as they always did, though some of them might glance toward the convent and feel an odd shiver crawl down their spines. They would quickly dismiss it, for there was no room in their lives for things like guilt and sorrow. They had no idea what had truly happened behind those walls. They would never know, but the land knew. The land remembered as the final echoes of the nuns' prayers died away, and the chapel grew heavy with their silence. A chill passed through the room. The air, which had been thick with the weight of the past, seemed to shudder, to ripple with a presence that had never fully gone away. It was as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the last breath of the fire would rise again, to remind them that it had never been fully extinguished. In the darkest corner of the chapel, the faintest flicker of light appeared, barely noticeable, a pulse of heat that shimmered in the air. The candlelight flickered once more, but it was not the same as before. It wasn't a flicker of light, but the flame that had once consumed everything. It was not a fire, but something darker, something that had been buried beneath the ashes, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The walls creaked, the air grew colder, and the silence became unbearable. The fire had never truly died, it had only been waiting. Agnes had been right. She had known all along. The flames had not consumed them. They had only smoldered beneath the surface, feeding on their guilt, on the things they had left undone. And now, in the shadows, in the place where the fire had once started, it began to rise again. The nuns, their faces still hidden beneath veils of sorrow and penitence, did not speak. They did not move. They had no words left to offer, no confessions left to make. The town was far away, oblivious to the terrible truth that had already returned. But the fire, the one that had never truly gone away, was back, and it would never be quenched. It would consume them all, eventually, and in the silence that followed, Agnes's spirit, like the echo of an old prayer, could only watch.